Hey roommates! On part two of Pain, Process, and Action, we get to sit down with Dr. Anita Phillips. She is a trauma therapist and an incredible pastor, alongside Cyntoia Brown, the author of Free Cyntoia and an advocate for prison reform. Through this conversation, we're going to be unpacking trauma and its side effects. Our goal is to acknowledge our pain, embrace the healing process, and discover our action steps. Let's get into it. On today's conversation, this is actually a continuation of a series that we started discussing pain, process, and action. And so what we're going to be focusing on today is trauma. And before we really get into it, Dr. Nita, I wanted to hear from your perspective how trauma can be defined.
The simplest definition of trauma is it is anything that changes the way you see God, yourself, or the world for the worse. Absolutely anything that does that can be considered a trauma. And it's really important to define it that way because we tend to compare pain. And so we define trauma as some big thing or bigger than what we've been through and then discount our own process. But anything that changes the way you see God, yourself, or the world for the worse is a trauma.
No, I love that take on perspective because even when I just think about like a perspective angle, I think about how oftentimes we misjudge people based on how we perceive them, and we don't take the time to get to know people's stories and their journey. One of the things that we took from the first part of this conversation series, there was a major takeaway that I received from a gentleman named Mr. Jason Wilson, and he talked about the word thug, but he described it to an acronym. And in that acronym, he talked about how a traumatized human being unable to grieve. And it was to stand as a contrast to how society views the thug. And his main intention was to kind of dismantle the negative connotation and give context to people who suffer from trauma. And so from just hearing about that, Cyntoia, when we go back to the 16-year-old facing life, and I think about what took place in the courtroom, the jury that came out, they were looking at the surface of what happened, not your story, not what you've been through, not the trauma that led up to that moment. And so I wanted to even start this question with you, that what was that moment like when you began processing the trauma that you experienced as a child?
So that moment didn't happen until many years after I was already serving my sentence, because so many things were happening one after another. So many traumas were compounding that I really didn't have time to unpack everything. I didn't have time to process everything. So I was well into my 20s when I started really just sitting down and unpacking what it was that I was carrying with me, when I started really looking at everything that I had gone through and how that had impacted me. And it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming, and I just had to take it one step at a time and be gentle with myself.
Wow. Just hearing that, there's one quote, and Dr. Nita, have so many of the things that you've spoken on, but there's a quote that you mentioned that I actually want to bring into this moment. You said that if we minimize the effects of abuse on the child within us, we risk minimizing the effects of abuse on the child in front of us. And so just in light of what Cyntoia just shared, can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Well, when I spoke on that, the topic was about healing self and being able to break generational repetition. And so often we're looking in the mirror, we see ourselves. I often encourage men and women who've been traumatized to find pictures of themselves from the age that it happened. Look at 7-year-old you. Look at 12-year-old you. Look at 16-year-old you, because in your mind, it's always you. But when you look and see that baby, that's a baby. At 16, we think we're grown. 17, we think we're so grown. But now at my age, in my 40s, I look at myself as 16. That is a baby. And so when we see ourselves in the state that we were really in when we were traumatized, I think we can be more compassionate and more accepting of the fact that we actually were damaged. We don't like to admit that because in some way it gives power to the person that hurt us. But accepting that we were vulnerable to be damaged is part of embracing who we are as human beings. And it allows us to be compassionate with ourselves so that we can then be compassionate with the children in our lives. Because sexual abuse is one example of trauma that runs in families. And you wonder, well, how could a mom who was sexually abused as a child miss the sexual abuse in her daughter's life? But if she has ignored it in her life, made it a blind spot, minimized its impact, then the child is unlikely to be protected, even though it is her desire to protect. She's reducing her capacity to protect the children in her life by not taking care of the child that's inside of her.
No, I love that. Cyntoia, I know that, right now you're living your best life with your husband. But looking ahead into your future, when kids start coming in, what can you speak to that when when you're holding your daughter in your arms and knowing that the journey of healing that you've been through, and knowing that now you can pour into her and cover her. I just want to hear, like, when you see yourself as a mother, what does that look like for you?
To be completely honest with you, when it comes to me thinking about being a mother, I just want to make sure that my child has the closest possible relationship with Jesus as they can, because I didn't understand the true importance of that. I didn't understand just how important that was to overcome trauma. So that's my main focus when it comes to raising a child, to try to prevent all the things that I went through.
I love that. I love that. I want to talk about even acknowledging of pain and trauma. Dr. Anita, to a certain degree in the Black community, we have been conditioned to live life in like this survivor mode. And even Cyntoia, I've heard you speak about living in this mentality of like, I'm in survival mode right now. And oftentimes to take that moment when we just have to pause and say that, you know what, this hurt me. It just feels like, now this is wasting my time. But we are in this place that quarantine has forced us, to face ourselves. But there's one thing with being forced into stillness, and there's another thing to embrace stillness. And so I want us to talk about, how do we get to that place of embracing stillness so that we can begin to acknowledge some of the things that we've gone through in our past.
There's been a significant rise in mental health struggles since the stay-at-home orders started back in mid-March. We saw anxiety levels spike. We saw crisis hotlines, suicide hotline calls overwhelmed, child abuse reports overwhelmed. So there's been a lot of stress and strain. And I think some of what is triggering some people is having to stay home, being forced to stay home. They may have loved being in their home before, but the sense of force, that I'm trapped here, has triggered many people and their childhood wounds to find themselves staying in their room all the time or eating too much. Whatever coping mechanisms they may have used in childhood to deal with some of their traumas have come to the surface. And in best case scenarios, people have then embraced that stillness as the opportunity to heal something that has been waiting for their attention all this time. Because we can live traumatized on a daily basis and look fine and seem fine because we've been in that mode since we were 14 or 15 years old, and suddenly have the opportunity to live in a way that is better and more free and more healed. This has really been it for a lot of people. And we've seen people coming into mental health care and joining online support groups and sharing their stories in a way that's allowing post-traumatic growth. And that's what we want to do. We want to grow.
No, I love that you highlighted even the forced into stillness, how to a degree that could even be counterproductive on some people. And just thinking about, Cyntoia, your time period in solitary confinement, that was a 2-year period. And that cannot even compare to the worst day on quarantine. Can you talk to us about that? How did that process, was that counterproductive for you, or was that actually something that benefited in your own journey to acknowledging some of the experiences of your past?
A little bit of both, actually, because when you're forced to be alone with yourself, with your thoughts, with everything that's kind of pushed to the back whenever you're busy and you're going through the day to day, it's overwhelming. And, a lot of people who are in solitary confinement, you find them struggling with anxiety, struggling with all kinds of things going on in their mind. I struggled through that. But once you get past that, once you get beyond that point, and you can really start unpacking things. You can really start evaluating things. You can really start thinking, well, this is how I've been reacting in life in the past, and this is what led me to this situation, but this is not where I want to be. You can start thinking of where you want to be in life. That is still different from, like you said, embracing stillness, because before I was forced into that stillness. Now I embrace that stillness because I've come to a point where I learned that when things are still, then I can focus and I can have my time to get closer to God. And for me on quarantine, that's just been the most rewarding thing, because so often we put so many things before him. We have to do this, we have to do that, we have to take care of everything else, but we don't take care of our relationship with him. And he always puts us first. And so for me to embrace that time to just give that back to him has been the most rewarding thing ever.
Now, even just as you were speaking, I'm thinking about the scripture talks about be still and know that I am God. And just that when we come to that place of quieting the noise and not being too focused on, okay, what else could be happening in my life right now, but kind of giving it a different perspective, that in this moment my relationship with God can grow. Dr. Anita, you're a pastor, and even as a pastor myself, I think that sometimes we find ourselves, because there is the responsibility where you have to speak to people and you have to prepare a message, and so you find yourself where even your time with the Lord is about other people. What do you want me to say to other people? And Cyntoia, I know you can attest to this too, because your voice is leading many that have encountered where you've been, but now you're leading them to that place of freedom and liberty. But we find ourselves in the presence of God for others. And there are times like this where we can be in the presence of God for ourselves. And so I really love that you mentioned that. And so just in light of, growth with the Lord, just want to talk about steps to healing, even after we've come to that place of acknowledging, right? And so, Cyntoia, I would even kick this off with you, because even as you just talked about faith, what role did faith play in your process? Because there's a story that you shared, and I love it so much. I was listening to it in an interview, and you talked about this mustard seed that you had received from a volunteer. And you would pray with that mustard seed, and you will hold it and you're rubbing it. And it's like, okay, God, you're going to do something. But to recognize that in your darkest moments, you are able to hold on, even literally, to a mustard seed of faith. What was the role of faith for you in healing?
So I loved Dr. Anita's definition of trauma, about anything that removes you further from the Lord. And it was when I met my husband that I realized that trauma had removed me from that closeness with God, had removed me from really having true faith. When I was holding that mustard seed, I was 16 years old, and I didn't understand what faith truly was. I didn't understand anything about having a relationship with God. I was practicing things that I had learned from religion growing up in a church, and I felt that if I did A, B, and C, then D would happen. That's not how it works. And I had to learn that. And so for me to really start working on my relationship with God, it started helping me to heal from a lot of those traumas. The traumas that I encountered, I was always made to feel that I was less than a person. I was always made to feel that my life somehow didn't count. But when I started looking at myself how he looks at me, everything completely changed. And it was just empowering beyond anything that I could ever tell you. And it was the faith that I developed after my husband showed me what faith was. He showed me about having a relationship that led to me being freed from prison.
Wow, I love that. And Dr. Anita, I want to hear this same question from you, because you have a podcast, In the Light, and that podcast is incredible, first of all. But on your first episode, you really opened up your world to us. You brought us into your home, and your mother was on that episode with you, and you guys had a discussion and a conversation about your sister Valerie, and just being so open and transparent about the the trauma that was experienced as a result of her mental illness. And so I wanted, if you could just talk about that with us and how faith played a role, because I'm just thinking about the young girl who is hearing her sister is 13 years old saying that, hey, saying things that seem violent and being scared for your life by the hands of your sister. I can't even begin to think about how that affected you. But what was that like for you, and how did faith play a role?
It was definitely very traumatizing for me. My sister at that time hadn't been diagnosed, but she had bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And so often it's easy to be sympathetic for people who are struggling with a mental illness when the symptoms are not aggressive, if they're just depressed or sad. But my sister's symptoms included being aggressive, impulsive, running away from home all the time, breaking rules for what seemed like no reason. And so her behavior towards me, but also the disruption in our family, was very traumatizing for me. It shook my faith as a young person, because I felt like, well, my parents love God and they're praying for her and she doesn't seem to be getting better. So if God's not answering their prayers, he's probably not going to answer my prayers. And so my broken heart really rose to the surface over what was happening in my spirit. And the Bible tells us that, right? Proverbs 15:13 says, by sorrow of the heart, the spirit is broken. And so many of us, our faith is damaged by our broken hearts. And so in similar fashion to what Cyntoia said, when some love found me, when my heart started healing, then my spirit started healing. Sometimes we try to start with spirit and jump over our broken heart, but that hurdle is too high. Sometimes God comes into that emotion space first, and he starts to heal the heart that broke the spirit. Because otherwise, if I heal the spirit, that heart will keep breaking it. And so when I went away to college, I was I met a young man who was at school, just friends, and he just kept on witnessing to me. And no matter how hard I told him I didn't want to hear about God, I cursed him out, I slammed doors in his face, he would knock again. Do you want to come to church with me? And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, really? And so finally I went to church because I just felt guilty for responding so negatively to someone asking me just to come to church. And God met me in that service, but I was just moved by that man's commitment, that fellow student, to loving on me and wanting to see me better. And so very often we'll find that when our hearts have been broken in a way that has broken our spirit, God will meet us in our heart first, lead us into that spirit space. And that's what happened for me. And it was a really personal experience that I had with God that night. I was 18 years old. And that changed my life forever. So being a preacher's kid had kind of put the firewood there, but there was nothing ablaze. But when I had that personal experience through my heart and into my spirit space, the fire of God's love came alive and just began to heal so many things for me. It was the beginning of my healing process. But now I'm a therapist, but I've also spent some time in the therapy room. I had some serious post-traumatic issues as a result of what we went through. My sister tried to kill us. I literally tried to kill our family. There was a lot of violence and chaos in the house. And so I had to spend my time in the therapy room too. So, we're spirit, soul, and body, and we can be in the therapy room and still be firmly rooted in the spirit too, just like we can go to the doctor's office and still be firmly rooted in the spirit. You got to take care of all of that stuff. And therapy really helped me to discover more about who I was and how I could heal and then continue on in what God called me to do.
Now, there's something you mentioned, and just to tie it into both of your stories, when you said, when love found me. And I am just amazed at the love of God, how it's revealed in so many different ways. That persistence, that chasing after, for you, it came in the form of that student who was just persistent, that I'm not even paying attention to what you're saying. Do you want to come to church tomorrow? And even in Cyntoia's story about her husband, there was this persistence and covering and protection. And so I love that. And I think that there are a lot of people out there, and they can, it's almost like there's a dynamic between those two stories that I really want us to press into, because for many people out there, they're looking for this love that would bring healing and that would bring restoration, or just someone, right, who would believe in them, someone who would say, "You got this." I think about how Cyntoia's husband, the first letter he writes to her, he's telling her, God is saying you're going to come out of prison. This is not the end for you. That student of yours who is like, "Hey, just come on, come with me. I know you may not want to hear from the Lord right now, but come along." How love can find us in so many ways. And so I want to ask the both of you, how important is it not only to bring people into your journey, but to open your heart to people being part of your journey?
Well, the Lord, he uses people as vessels.
Mm-hmm.
So, you just never know when he's going to use someone to speak to you or to touch your life, to bless you in some way.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for us to be open, but also for us to be discerning.
Yeah.
You definitely have to be discerning when it comes to people. I can't tell you just what a blessing, it is that I look back at how my husband reached out to me, and I actually paid attention to that letter. I actually responded to that letter because it has completely changed my life. I wouldn't know Jesus the way that I know him if it weren't for that, because I was in that place where you were at one time, where anyone who tried to talk to me about the Lord, I just brushed them off. I had even come to a place where I said I didn't believe, and yet and still God pursued me. So it's just every day I think about that, and I'm just so blessed. So we definitely need to keep ourselves open for that.
Yeah, and I think we need to be open to taking care of other people that way as well. What is so difficult sometimes for women, especially if we've been through trauma, is that we don't always have experiences with healthy relationships. We don't have experiences with people not wanting anything from us. And way too many young women and older women don't have experience with non-sexual care. It's like, if they don't want to sleep with me, why are they here? You know what I mean? So she had this man who became her husband, just showing her the love of God. I had just a friend who was a student. We were never in a romantic relationship. So often we're looking for romance to heal us, but connection heals us. And when we haven't had experiences with healthy connection or healthy friendship, and it's always been sexualized, we can miss it. And so I encourage people listening to be open to God showing you something clean and pure in terms of love.
Yeah.
Because it's available, and it could be it could be one of your girlfriends. It could be the person at the grocery store who encourages you every time you go through the line. God is so determined to get to us. The prayer can be, God, open my ears and heart to hear you if you're there. And that's the other thing. We can be so honest. Like, God, I don't even know if I believe in you right now, but I'm going to just ask you to help me anyway. Even that little bit of opening will make space for God to find us.
I love that, because even in that connection, because I believe that there are many people that are going to watch this, and they're looking for God, but God is in the details. God is in the character. That person, that girlfriend, that friend in your life who is persistent, with their patience, with their love, with their kindness, that is God showing up, And so just to hear this, I know that by itself is just going to bring so much healing, because many times we want God to come through in a certain way. And he's like, I'm right there. I'm the neighbor who is showing you kindness every single day to let you know that I see you. Someone is watching over you, literally. And I just want to be that voice to you. So I really love the point of connection. Connection is what heals us. And so that's powerful. But even thinking about it from a community perspective, right now, our community, we are experiencing what I believe, you're the professional here, Dr. Anita, but what I believe is collective trauma. And not only due to COVID-19 that is affecting the Black community, but also when we think about the recent murders from Ahmaud Arbery, from Breonna Taylor, to George Floyd, to Rayshard Brooks. And for me in particular, Rayshard Brooks, when I watched the video, when I saw photos of his family, his wife, his 3 daughters, I didn't even realize that triggered me in a certain way, because when I saw George Floyd's murder, I was enraged. I was just angry. When I saw Rayshard's, I was emotionally depleted. I just felt like it affected me in a different way, and I couldn't understand it. It wasn't until like a couple days later for me that just in the presence of God, and I'm like, wow, why this has a very heavy toll on me. And then it hit me when I had seen the picture of his wife and his three daughters. It made me think of my father, because when he was murdered, he was left with my mother and three kids. And so it was almost like I was reliving, seeing that these kids don't even know what the world that they're going into, this mother, like, just to pray over them and cover them. And so in thinking about that, first of all, how is everything that is happening right now, how is that affecting you all? And have you felt triggered in any way by just what has been in the headlines?
Mm. Well, let me ask you a question first.
Yes, I knew this was coming.
How did you move from that triggered state once you recognized it? How did you move from that triggered state out of that triggered state? What was the transition or the process for you?
To be honest, I don't know, because one of the things I mean, even in this conversation, is how we even acknowledge that we've been traumatized, and I think that what I love about when I have conversations with different people is that I also find my healing in that, so what I'm posing to you both, there are questions that I have for myself, because how that affected me for such a long time, for many years in my life, I never realized that I was traumatized by my father's murder, because in my mind, I was a baby. I was about 8 months old. And so when people would talk about it, when I would tell someone and I'm like, oh yeah, my father was murdered, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, no, I wasn't even there, really. Barely. And even though it's not something funny, but I was so disconnected from it and so removed from it that it was just about growing up without him there, that maybe was more traumatic. But the acknowledgement of saying this was a traumatic experience for me is not a firm reality to me, having that impact when I saw what happened to Rashad, and seeing especially the photo of his wife and her three kids, it really moved me, because I'm like, wow, I did not think that it would be tied to thinking about my father.
Yeah, trauma is tricky in that it gets down in the body. It's not just in our minds, but it literally gets into our physical bodies. And when we lose someone the way you lost your dad, even when you were very small, we would call that an attachment trauma or an attachment wound. There was an attachment there. You heard his voice echoing even when your mom was carrying you. And then that figure is gone. That's a loss. That is a trauma. And it gets into the body itself. And we underestimate what disruptions in attachment can do to us over the long term, but they can damage us in a lot of ways. What's beautiful is you were able to find that truth in your prayer closet, which is a safe place for you and probably helped you in recovery. But recovering from trauma is a process, and I don't want to say it's never fully over, but losses take on different meanings at different times in our lives, right? So imagine that this is the trauma and this is life. And life has a cycle. And so my husband lost his dad when he was 11. Boom, he hit that trauma. And then when he graduated high school, pop, it came back around because he noticed not having my dad at my high school graduation. That was a new manifestation. And then he's going on with his life and pop, he gets married. And we're getting married and I never got to meet his dad. And so there'll be times when life will bring you back around to that trauma. The key is when we do that, how do we manage that new encounter? Because it's a new loss. It's a new grief. And how we manage that determines if we go down from there or up from there. But either way, we will cycle by it again. And so you ran into it again. But it sounds like, at least, that in your prayer closet, it was a safe space and you have work in there that allows you to kind of recover. And so you pop, but you continue to grow. But sometimes we don't have the skill to handle that run-in, we'll find ourselves spiraling down. And that might mean that we need to deepen our spiritual relationship. It might mean that we need to reach out and get some help from a therapist or a support group or our loved ones. But, that once and for all thing is just isn't real. And man, it would be awesome if it was. But we will find as the years go by that we'll run into certain things. And so in some areas, we'll have recovered and moved into growth. And in some areas, we might still find out that we're a little bit shaken. You know, after I got out of my family home, and my parents are wonderful, it's just my sister's mental illness just tore everybody apart. And then I got married and everything was going along good. And when I saw the positive pregnancy test stick, I completely fell apart inside. Did not expect that to happen. But I started hearing all these things coming back from my mom's fears because she didn't understand what was wrong with my sister. And there was a sense of powerlessness as a parent, maybe I can't do anything. What if this goes badly? And so that was, I hit it again. And I had to work through that to make sure that those fears didn't interfere with me as a mother. So trauma is tricky. You know, it may play a role in our lives over the years, but that doesn't mean that we're not growing or getting better. It just means that we may have suffered a new loss from an old thing. And now we need to process that. And that's okay.
Wow, suffered a new loss from an old thing. Wow. Cyntoia, does that speak to you? Because this is speaking to me.
Well, you know, for me, when it comes to the trauma that I had dealt with, what it came down to is the lies that I was told, the lies that I was led to believe about myself. And so if there are ever situations where that comes back up, where, you know, the enemy tries to whisper to me and tell me that I'm not enough and, you know, that I'm not loved, that I'm not worthy, I just call it for what it is. It's a lie. I'm not going to allow my life to be run by lies. I'm not going to allow my life to be run by trauma. I talk a lot about the role of forgiveness in overcoming, the role of forgiveness for yourself, for other people. And, you know, that's, Jesus said it the whole time. He told us the whole time how important that was. And for me, that's the best tool that we have in combating and overcoming trauma.
No, so you just brought something that is huge up, and I really want you to unpack that for us a little bit, because forgiveness is so key. You know, it in my life, when even talking about my father's murder, his cousin was the one responsible. And this cousin for me was an uncle that I loved as a kid. We did not find out till I was about maybe 12 or something like that. So I grew up knowing my uncle. I grew up him coming to the house, loving on him. And he was my favorite uncle from my father's side. And then this whole thing comes about that he was actually the one who sent assassins against my father. And I remember back then, you know, even because I encountered the Lord early, about 9 years old. And when I had spoke to the Lord about it, the first thing that was on my heart was about forgiveness. And it was just about to forgive my uncle and to see him from a God perspective, not negating what he did, but to recognize that he's acting out from the place of his own pain and his own trauma and his own you know, jealousy and all kinds of things in life. And so forgiveness was such a huge thing. And the way the Lord began to teach me forgiveness at a young age is what I carried on throughout my life. And so even as you talk about forgiveness, because there's forgiveness of self, there's forgiveness of others that played a role into the things that broke us as children. But where you are today, I really want you to just unpack how forgiveness played a role to you getting to where you are today.
So my first experience, I'd say, with forgiveness was when I found out that the person who had taught my first college class, who I had come to know as a friend, it turns out that he was actually a prosecutor in my case. So this was a man, while I was fighting with everything in me to become free, he was fighting with everything that he had to keep me locked up. Wow. And I had to have that moment where it was like, wow, wait a minute. And I learned that, you know, he was operating from a different place, right? He was operating out of a place where that's what he felt was the right thing to do, however erroneous it may be. I have to have some kind of understanding from where he was coming from. Don't have to agree with it. Don't have to think it's okay. But I can see that, and I can recognize that, and I can see that, you know, he was remorseful for what he had done. And I couldn't allow that to just wipe away everything about who he was. That couldn't define who he was as a person. And that led me to confront other things. And it's like, wow, I know I've made mistakes. I've hurt people in my life, and I can't ask that someone forgives me and sees me as a whole person apart from that one incident, apart from that one behavior, if I'm not willing to do the same thing. And so it's really just taking a step out of that snap reaction to just see the world as black and white and understand that it's full of gray area. Being a human in this world is an extremely complex thing, and sometimes there's just situations where you have to have forgiveness. Sometimes there's situations where there's no excuse and it's not okay, but you have to forgive in order to move on from that yourself. So it's just forgiveness is it's difficult, and it's definitely something that I had to lean on the Lord to do for a lot of situations.
No, I love that. And just even to continue in that conversation, right now, I think that many of us find ourselves in this tension between just when we look at the civil unrest that has taken place in this country, the tension between how we walk in forgiveness and how we advocate for justice. And so, Dr. Anita, I'd love to hear, you on this. How do we live in that tension? How do we live in that world to say, okay, I'm not going to look at this person with hate in my heart, but I'm still going to advocate for justice? How do we, because I think many of us find ourselves where, the scale is a bit unbalanced, where sometimes we're moving and it's coming from a place of hate and rage. And we have to step back and say, okay, I'm forgiving you, but I'm advocating for justice at the same time. How do we live in that?
Dr. King urged us to focus on fighting systems, not. He identified the three, he called them the triple evils, right? Racism, poverty, and militarism. And he urged us to keep our eye on the system, battle the system, not a person. And I take that really to heart because I am a feisty girl and I have a little temper. And like Cyntoia said, forgiveness is not my first talent. I have to work for it. Okay. And so one of the ways that I deal with that is by minimizing my offense in the first place, right? If I don't have to forgive you, if I don't even get angry with you or offended by you in the first place. So I try to keep my eye on the ball, because if it drops down to individual people around me in this fight for justice, that's going to drain energy that we need. And this is going to take energy. It's going to take time. It's going to take persistence. And if we're allowing that to be drained because we focused on the person across the street or an individual who's holding a certain office, we have to pour our energy into changing systems in order to maintain that balance between fierce love and justice. And so whose advice better to follow than Dr. King's? So I'm riding with him on that one, because otherwise I'll get myself in a lot of trouble. And I want to be able to fight this fight well.
I love that. I love that. I mean, that really even speaks to me, because I do find myself in those moments, especially just at the height of everything. And it's like, where do you say enough is enough, but you're still making sure that your heart is pure, because your heart is really, it's all you really have. Like, if my heart is contaminated, I cannot function. I cannot move forward in any aspect of my life. And so making sure, like, no matter what we're moving for, we're fighting for, but keeping a pure heart in the midst of all of that.
We're all Christians first. That's really critical. I'm a Christian first.
Yes.
Always. So even in the fight for racial justice, or whether I'm doing therapy with someone, I am his first.
Yes.
And there are certain emotions that are not congruent with the fruit of the Spirit. And if I'm having too many of those, then I'm out of line. I've gotten into, as we say in church, I'm in the flesh. I'm not the Spirit now. And I am responsible to God, because the boundaries of my relationship with God don't allow for me to exist in that way. And so if it gets to the point where I'm so furious I can't pray for someone, because then I'm out. I'm in the wrong. And so we have to make sure that our faith is the context in which we do everything. We have to be accountable spiritually first to make sure that we process the emotions that need to be processed and watch our motives.
What would you both speak to when you say, I am a Christian first, to Christians who feel as though what it means to carry your faith with you seems timid to the world?
Well, for me, personally, that's one of the things when someone speaks about, Jesus as being timid. Jesus was not timid at all. He was very bold. When I look at things that are going on right now in our country, I think about how he handled things when he was here on earth. The way he dealt with the Pharisees, the way he spoke up about injustice. He was very bold. And so we're looking at the battles that are going on. We need to keep in mind that at the end of the day, this is a spiritual battle. Yes, it has physical manifestations, but we have to be prepared spiritually to battle. So when things are going haywire and going crazy out in the world, and I really don't understand, I'm having emotions rise up in me, rage rise up in me at things going on, that's when I need to take that to God. That's when I need to go to him, because I know at the end of the day, this is a spiritual battle.
And we all have our role to play in the movement. Not everybody plays the exact same role. But where the Bible says the blessings of the Lord maketh rich and addeth no sorrow, we think about that in terms of money all the time. But it's not just about money. If I'm really moving in my role, what God has called me to do, it's not going to burn me down. I'm not going to be so overcome by rage that I can barely sleep at night. I'm not going to have my anxiety levels spiking while I'm doing what God told me to do. You know what I mean? So we need to, it's sometimes hard. That's why it says the Bible, the word of God divides between soul and spirit.
Yeah.
People are calling something spirit that really rose from their soul, their emotional state they wanted to do, or vice versa. So we have to be careful, and it takes self-awareness.
One of the things that I really even want to dive into, because when I look at both of your lives, it's so inspiring to me, because I see that your life's work has almost seemed like a response to what you both have been through in life. Right now, Dr. Anita, you're an amazing pastor. You're a therapist leading people to their own healing from trauma. Despite what you had been through. Looking at you, Cyntoia, you're living your best life, child. But you're an advocate for prison reform. And despite everything you've been through, it's almost like the things that you're doing right now is responding to the very trauma that you experienced. And so I would love to hear from you both. How do we turn our pain into purpose?
Well, for me, it was as I looked over my journey and all those moments that had taken me further from God, where I thought, he can't possibly be here. He can't possibly care for me, because why would he allow this to happen? And coming to a place where I realized, he had a plan this whole time, and realizing that his plan for my life, like that's a purpose in itself. And it has purpose to heal other people, to free other people, and it empowers me. I don't feel I have a choice other than to do the work that I'm doing now. He had every intention of me going through what I went through so that I could help someone else. And, that's how I turn, my pain into what I'm doing now. And it's incredible just to think about the role, that I can play in his plan.
I feel that same sense of gratefulness as well, that you survived and that other people can be touched. When I first started the podcast and really telling the details of what it was like in our home and our family, I can't tell you the number of messages that I got where people were like, this happened, this was a secret at our house. You're the first person that ever said it out loud. I mean, just for people to be freed from sharing the experience, I can't say that I set out to do it this way. I was definitely looking for an explanation. I wanted to know what had made my sister's life the way that it was. And she passed away a few years ago, and that kind of triggered me to start talking about it more. But I just wanted to understand it, right? So I was studying for the answer. But then when I realized I was really trying to understand my own pain, because see, for a while it was like, oh, it's about her. I want to understand what happened to her. But really, I wanted to understand what happened to me. And once I got into that honest space and I started to heal from what had happened for me, how can you not share that? So it's just, I could not do anything else. It's not like, oh gosh, the Lord is forcing me to do it. This is it right here. Every single time you see someone get it, you see a light come on in their eyes because you shared your story, because you prayed with them, because you sat with them. It's addictive to see people get free. I'm addicted to it. nothing else for me to do.
No, I love that so much because, it makes me, I've always been intrigued by the idea of a painful journey, and even how within that in itself, like, because we always talk about the purpose and the pain,
Mhm.
and when I hear you both just share from this, it's almost as though would we receive this today if not for your past?
Mhm.
Many people right now, there are questions. Dr. Anita, you on your podcast, you had asked your mom, what is it that maybe you sought the Lord for, and your mother talked about how she would ask the Lord why. Why
Mhm.
is this happening? And there was never a response. Yet her love for him was so real, so authentic, that she was like, you know what, I will keep going twice as hard for you. I'll keep traveling, I'll keep ministering, I'll keep talking about your love and talking about who you are, even though you don't answer me in the why is this happening. And I just wonder, from both of you, did you ever find a place in your life where you question God, where it's just like, and what was that like for the person right now who is questioning God?
The Bible says that when we talk about, well, why did this bad thing happen, or why did that
Mm-hmm.
bad thing happen? The Bible says that it's because of the enemy. The devil sins from the beginning. That's what happened. And because sin is in this world, there's going to be mess. But then it goes
Mm-hmm.
on to say that for this purpose was the Son of God manifested to destroy the works of the enemy.
Yes.
I want to make sure we differentiate between the work of the Son and the work of the enemy. The Bible says it's the enemy. The devil sins from the beginning. But for
Mm.
this purpose was the Son of God manifested to destroy his works. And so when God shows up to destroy the works of the enemy in my life, then he forces all things to work together for my
Yes.
good. And so now he pulls purpose out of my pain. But I'm always careful to determine that it was God who wounded me in the first
I
place.
love
Now,
that.
good father. So sometimes he allows me to go through some hardships to work on my character, just like I allow my children to stumble and fall so that they can learn their way. But I don't abuse them. I would never damage them. And so let's be careful. We don't attribute something to God that was the work of the enemy, because we do have an adversary. And we know that Jesus shows up to destroy his works and pull purpose out of pain that
Mm-hmm.
came from the enemy. And there's a difference there between that and God allowing me to walk through something as a good father to develop my character, because so many people have been spiritually traumatized,
Yeah.
being told that something unspeakable that happened to them was God's will to strengthen them.
I love that.
Spiritual trauma. So we have to make sure we give the credit to God and we put the blame on the enemy when he's been the one. And we can come out of that. God's going to make it work out for our good and make it so that, for me, I look back and I wouldn't necessarily want things to be different. I want them to be different for my sister. Maybe she'd still be alive, but the opportunity to be a healing tool, it's been enough. It's been more than enough repayment for what I lost.
Right. So for me, questioning God, I completely questioned his entire existence.
Mm-hmm.
When, I was 16, I knew what I was taught in church. I knew what, the preacher had sat up and said every Sunday. And so I felt that if I prayed every single day, if I pray with this mustard seed, this is truly going to happen, because I was always taught, ask and it shall be given unto you. And when I saw that wasn't happening, I said, well, maybe I'm not doing this right. Maybe somehow I got this wrong. And I kept trying and I kept searching, for a way to just do this religion thing right. And that was what was going to get me out of prison. Mm-hmm. And the final straw was when my appeals kept getting denied. And it was like, wow, wait a minute. I have been praying and I've been praying and I've been praying that I not do life in prison, that I not be convicted, that I not even be tried as an adult, and this keeps happening. If this keeps happening, there must not be a God who listens to me. This can't be real. And for years, I went around saying that it wasn't real. I had all these rational explanations for things. I had all these scientific reasons for why we were here. I spoke things about evolution and anything to run away from the truth that no, there was a God. And he loved me, and the God of the Bible is very real. And I went through that for almost, I think, 10 years of my life. Wow. But it was when I realized that it was just me struggling with understanding why those things had happened. Because like you said, I was blaming God for those things happening in my life. Why did he allow this to happen? He must not be real. When I saw that there was a plan, and even though that I had put myself in certain situations, other people had made choices that put me in situations, and the enemy got a hold of me. He still rescued me from that. He was still able, and he did it once I allowed him to, once I came to him, once I developed that relationship with him. And then I saw that, just like you said, he completely turned everything around in my life. And it just, everything worked together so perfectly. And I mean, I couldn't have made it up. I couldn't have written it myself. If I was writing about it, it was just perfect the way that he had written the way my life played out. And so for anyone who's questioning God, take it from me, he is very real. I have been there. I have denied him. I have said that it wasn't real. And he spoke to me. He showed me things in dreams that no science textbook ever could have done. That nothing other than God himself could have shown me. So there's no questioning it. I know beyond the shadow of a doubt he is real. From the things that my husband wrote me when he wrote me that letter saying that I was getting out after the court, every single court had said that it wasn't going to happen. And then lo and behold, here I am. That tells you that he is a living God. He speaks to people. He will speak to you. And when your time is right, you're going to have a moment where you're confronted, and just please seize that moment, because it is going to be the most rewarding thing that you've ever done with your life.
I love that. I think this is such a beautiful place to pray into. And actually, Cyntoia, I would even ask you to just cover this in prayer for everyone watching, because what you both just touched on literally would bring so much breakthrough to somebody watching right now that was in that is currently in that very place that we all have been, right? And so I really want us to really just cover that in prayer.
All right. Father God, I come to you right now and just ask that, you just step into this place and speak to whoever is listening here right now, whoever feels that they haven't heard you, that they don't know you. Maybe they don't even believe that you're real. I pray that you speak to them in a way that only you can. Speak to them, speak to that pain that they feel, all those doubts that the enemy has put in their head, the lies that they've been told. I want you to just speak to them, please, Father, and let them know that you are real, that you are more powerful than anything that has ever come against them, that your truth can completely overtake all the lies that they've taken in themselves. Trauma is nothing to you. There's nothing on this earth that is more powerful than you. And I pray that they just accept that. I pray that they start to just come under your will, God. So many times we're just so consumed with the things that we want to do, the things that we feel should be done, how we should fix things. And we often find ourselves just making things worse than they were in the beginning. I know, that's been my problem. And I'm sure other people here, they've encountered that same thing. But I pray that people just learn to just give things to you, because they can do all things through you. You can do all things. And just pray that your will is done in their life, Father. And it's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen.